is the guest in favor of the nuclear vaccine? It's saved 2 million people since 1970.
The nuclear vaccine? I don't know what you mean.
It's a joke about nuclear energy.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, because we're big simps for nuclear energy over here.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I guess if you don't mind, maybe we can like kind of talk about the big issue about like, climate change, and then talk about like the solutions afterwards, which would be like, nuclear energy and technologies and stuff like that. So I guess to better like ground the conversation.
This was the impetus to want to talk to me. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that humans are having a negative impact on the environment. It's actually the reason why I am a scientist. Sure. And I think that the latest Inflation Reduction Act that had a bunch of climate change stuff in it, I'm a huge proponent of it. I think it did an awesome job. And I
would like Chad to just know for a quick second that this was a brilliant pivot by Greg to not answer the question in terms of whether or not he's a large proponent of nuclear energy. But we'll continue anyways.
So nuclear, I think that all technology should be researched. If you like nuclear, research nuclear. Like, I'm not, going to say don't.
It's another pivot.
I'm not going to say don't do.
Not answering the question.
But the problem is there's, there are some problems with nuclear, and you kind of have to go to all, a lot of different types of renewables because it isn't renewable. Fundamentally, nuclear is not renewable, and my bigger point is that it only solves one problem, which is emissions. So it's not renewable, and it only targets emissions, and we're actually impacting the environment in a lot of different ways more than just emissions. So and there's things like,
I think nuclear is just obviously known to be the safest form of energy, the cleanest form of energy, and the best form of energy. Okay. And I think the fear mongering around nuclear is abhorrent Malthusian bullshit pushed by states and corporations and environmental activists whose goals are in no way, shape, or form aligned with a healthier, happier planet. If you want a healthier, happier planet and people, you should just be supporting nuclear, full stop. Obviously, there are problems with any form of energy that need research and need solving. But I just think that if you're not seriously promulgating nuclear, I kind of just don't take that person's takes on climate change seriously, because I just don't believe that person is legitimately informed. They're either ideologically captured in some way to not be honest about climate change, or something else is occurring, because I don't believe anybody that says that they don't support nuclear as the best option, and then offers some forms of other skepticism and things like that, because it's just. Yeah, anyone that I know that I've ever met that's passionate, from anarcho-communists like Your Environment Seattle, all the way to hardcore right-wingers, once they dig into the science and the understanding of it, they go, wow, this is obviously the best option.
Yeah, it's an option for one thing, for emissions only, but we are impacting the environment in a lot of different ways, and I'm a proponent of nuclear in scenarios.
What's our best option? There's nothing comes without cost, right? And energy production by humans is going to have costs, right? Right. But can you name an option other than maybe geothermal, which is, location specific, right? But can you, an option that could be adopted kind of universally, so long as they have the technological scientific means to do it and they have the resources, in terms of money. Yeah. Right. So, can you name an option better than nuclear? So
nuclear is a really good point and a good technology for places that are really basically small and very densely packed. So for example, Japan, which is an island. Cities, yeah. So you don't have that much space. You don't have that much open space. So it's a really good option for countries like that. Countries that are larger, that have open space, that have a land for solar arrays and wind. Those are a lot cheaper per kilowatt than nuclear. And they're renewable, which nuclear just isn't.
They're less renewable and more dangerous than nuclear.
I mean, nuclear isn't renewable.
Neither is solar or wind.
Of course it is. How would it not be?
No, because the wind itself is renewable, right? Sunlight is renewable, but the precious metals, the mining, the construction of these things, and the potential damage that specifically wind turbines do is, has detrimental impacts, but also has a carbon footprint. For example, solar panels that are designed to last like 30 years, they don't really become carbon neutral, right, until about 7 years after production. And they usually get replaced after 15 years, right? So obviously they're better than, let's say, burning coal, right? But in terms of calling it, renewable, and then saying, oh, well, thimerosal, not thimerosal, thorium, right, and other, less researched nuclear technology, but even, regular enriched uranium, saying that these things are not renewable because there's a finite amount of that specific resource, even though we have enough thorium to power the planet probably for the next 40,000 years at least. And it's cheap if we can simply get the research done like China's doing. But to say that that's not renewable, but something that requires precious metals in order to produce is renewable, I think it's a misnomer, because the energy source is renewable, but the reality of producing the things that are required in order to produce the energy is not necessarily renewable. And of course, wind and solar comes with other problems that, nuclear doesn't have. Like you said, for wide open spaces, it might be a part of the solution for sure, right? Mm-hmm. But there's also problems with like energy load, right? The battery technology, which of course comes with all kinds of other environmental issues, right? To store solar is an issue, and brownouts and blackouts can be a real big deal if the energy grid is too dependent upon solar and wind at nighttime when the wind's not blowing, right? You know what I mean? Like you have to store that energy somewhere else so that it can be used during those times. And if the energy grid dips too low, you end up with blackouts or brownouts. Like there's a lot of, it's a more complicated thing than just, it's renewable because the sun exists. You know what I mean?
I mean, nuclear has a lot of the same problems though with batteries. I mean, a lot of that energy has to be stored places. It has to be, you're basically talking about electric vehicles, and that those electric vehicles have the same problems that you're talking about. And this is...
Yeah, but the difference is that there's not a differential in power production based upon the availability of wind or solar, right? So while yes, there's still battery technology and storing of energy and things like that, we're not in a position where like we can only farm sunlight, at a maximum for 14 hours a day. Whereas with nuclear, a nuclear plant can run 24/7. It doesn't need to have different times where it's producing different outputs of energy. Now, granted, there is some environmental things that can happen with nuclear. For example, a lot of it depends upon water, right? And if that water levels like decrease significantly, like that can produce like we're seeing this in France currently, right? Because they're having a pretty bad drought. And so some of their nuclear plants are reduced because they're dependent upon the Rhine. So there are environmental concerns with nuclear in terms of like whether or not it can produce energy, but much, much less so than solar or wind.
Yeah, I mean, there's not going to be one solution. And I think that's the problem with a lot of like nuclear people that only talk about this. Like it's kind of frustrating because again, we're talking about solutions of emissions, and of which nuclear is an option. And I'm not even saying that we should be 0% nuclear. There's going to have to be a lot of different options. A lot of hydro, like hydroelectric dams are a great example of hydroelectric's basically a big battery, because all a battery is a difference of electric potential. So that's a great store of energy. And it is cheaper to make solar and wind turbines, and you don't have to deal with the waste too. So it's big.
First of all, it's not cheaper. It's not cheaper to produce solar and wind for the amount of power that you get. That's not what the IPCC says. I mean, exactly right. Yeah. And let me explain to you why.
Okay.
It takes 3 years of government regulators in America, right? For you to actually open a factory. It is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, right? Just to get inspections and get through the paperwork loopholes. It is one of the most regulated industries in America. And that is the reason why the costs are so high. It's not that nuclear is prohibitively expensive compared to wind and solar. It's that wind and solar get constant subsidies from the government. They are given free money so that their corporate friends that are in support of these things can produce it at a lower cost than the market demands. And nuclear is heavily regulated so that it's massively more expensive. And the fear mongering and the insurance costs are also extremely expensive. The fact of the matter so that's number one. It's not more expensive. It's just more expensive now because of the government standing in the way and causing it to be more expensive, and then stealing your tax dollars to specifically give money to wind and solar. The second thing that I would say is that in terms of dealing with the nuclear waste, I think I agree with what you're saying. Nuclear waste does have to be dealt with. But I think a real huge problem with having that conversation is the massive mythology of what nuclear waste disposal looks like, because people imagine barrels of green goo that are going to poison the environment, when really all of the world's nuclear waste could fit in a single football field today and could be properly contained, dug 100 feet deep. Right? Like it is in Norway, for example, they literally have people go and look at nuclear waste as part of a museum exhibit because it's perfectly safe after you put a couple feet of concrete in between it. And you can go check out a museum exhibit. So when we say, oh, well, we have to deal with the nuclear waste, it's like, yeah, except we can use those rods every 20 years again for slightly less capacity, right? I think it's like something like 88%, and then there's like kind of a fall off. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about thousands and thousands of years before like we're just storing waste that actually we can't reuse. And even still, there are tons of technologies that could be developed. There's nuclear plants now for small nuclear plants that are built completely underground. And then after like they go through like a round of production for like 20 years, they like are close off and collapse in on themselves, and then they're just done. Like there's tons of solutions to this. But when we say nuclear waste, we think of like this dangerous, horrible thing. It pales in comparison to the environmental damage done by solar and wind, done by the farming of precious metals, done by the slavery for the conflict metals that are used in that technology. The rape and the murders and the death of people and the poisoning of villages in Africa over and over again. Like, both from a human cost and a financial cost and an environmental cost, solar especially, it just fucking loses, dude. It's a solution for like maybe 5-10% of the grid, but it should never be our primary solution. Our primary solution right now should be nuclear.
I mean, so if you're saying that the regulatory part of wind and solar is the biggest problem with it, are you saying in your anarcho-capitalist utopia you have wind and solar power as the primary? Is that that's what it sounds like?
No, you said nuclear, not wind and solar, nuclear.
No, but I thought I was just thinking about like if the state wasn't involved and you don't have all these regulatory elements anymore, then you'd be more of a proponent of wind and solar. Is that what you're saying?
I think the market is a more effective, better regulator than government is. I think that government is a monopoly on regulation that allows for regulatory capture, where certain industries with large amounts of capital are able to purchase politicians and lobby for certain types of things. And what often ends up happening is the most powerful and wealthy and the most well-connected have the capacity to make regulations for thee, but not for me. And I think that in a free society where our government doesn't have a monopoly on power and violence and regulation, that what will actually occur is healthier, better regulation on those industries. That's probably more strict and than our current things, but more pointed towards those that actually damage and harm humans, as opposed towards regulations that get in the way of large corporations pushing, damaging things like wind and solar.
Okay, interesting. I mean, when you're talking about like the damages of wind and solar, it seems like you're talking a lot about like the mining. You're talking about a lot of the rare earth mineral mining, that kind of thing. The labor that's being stolen for that.
Well, and the carbon as well. I'm also talking about the emissions, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Because you don't get carbon neutral for like the first 7 years, right?
Okay.
So there's still an admission cost to all the mining and the precious metals and the construction. And then these things are usually, manufactured in China. So then there's shipping of all of those things and then shipping across the country. Like there's a lot of emissions. Now, some of those emissions obviously could be solved, right? Like if we had,
national production.
If everything was let's imagine a world where everything is solar powered, right? Mm-hmm. Well, then mining of the solar powered stuff wouldn't cause as much carbon because the mining equipment would be solar powered, right? You know what I mean? Like so more solar power means less carbon for the solar power. I'll bite that bullet for sure. But yeah,
I mean, with a lot of, the Inflation Reduction Act's like climate change bills, a big portion of that, I think it's like $100 billion is just about national production of those things. So we're no longer, building those things in China. We're no longer shipping them like you're talking about. I mean, is that something that you're in favor of?
Well, I'll never be in favor of spending billions of dollars for anything from the government. That's stolen money, right? Like that's it's a scarce resource that they took out of the economy to slow down technology, innovation, jobs, happiness, and health of humans, and then reinvested it in the places that they believe it should go. And it's always going to be less efficient than the market. And it's always going to fall, the road to certain kind of Hayekian issue, which is, in order to calculate price, they need to do research in a way that the market doesn't. And so that's wasted resources that is destroyed. And so, yeah, I'll never be in favor of it. Even though if I had to choose, like gun to my head, right? And it's like I'm stealing $100 million. That's not a choice you get, right? Where this $100 million goes, is it going to be more research on the F-21, the new plane we're going to waste billions of dollars on and then just end up sending to Israel because it sucks, versus investing in energy? I guess, sure. I mean, like, if I have no choice, I would prefer that, right? But I'm never going to be in favor of a rights violation.
Okay. I mean, I guess to the bigger point then, like, I mean, you're talking about the destruction of the environment. You said earlier that you didn't think that you thought the humans were having a negative impact on the environment. I mean, I guess I
think it's unquestionable that humans have a negative impact on the environment. I value human life more than I give a fuck about the environment. The environment could rot and fucking destroy itself if that process doesn't harm humans. I don't give a fuck. If we could kill all the bees and it didn't like fuck with pollination, like why the fuck do I give a fuck that there are less bees, right? Because honey's more expensive? Well, now that's a problem. That affects humans. But I don't give a fuck about the bees. I don't give a fuck. I mean, I actually do donate to Apis M because I care about the bees, because that's why I'm bringing that up, because I think it is important to the environment. But what I'm concerned with is human happiness, flourishing, wealth, and the ability to innovate. But I think it's undeniable that humans negatively impact the environment in some ways. Now, what do I believe the doom and gloom kind of scientists that say the Earth is ending in 10 years, every 10 years since the 1970s? No, of course I don't believe that shit, because they're wrong every 10 years, and then they just never like admit that they were wrong, and then they're like, but this time Florida really will be underwater. It's like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But like, there's obviously an effect. And it's probably not good for humans in some regard. It's probably something that needs to be tackled. But I don't think governments are the way to tackle that. I don't think stealing technological innovation is the way to do it. I think freeing the market and getting rid of those regulations is the way that we solve that.
Yeah, I guess I just see human health being tied to environmental health. So you can't really have the destruction of the entire environment and also have a human population that's healthy.
Oh, I agree.
And thriving.
I agree. Yeah, I agree to that. Yeah, I just think the market would be better at solving that.
Okay. I mean, I mean, I've had, so full disclosure, I mean, I've had, labs that I've worked in, like, funded by the National Science Foundation, by the Department of Defense, and I had a personal fellowship from the Department of Defense. So, full transparency, just letting you know. But a lot of those, large government entities, I mean, they're giving jobs, right? They're creating jobs by creating scientist positions.
Government can't create jobs. It's impossible for the government to create jobs.
I mean, how else would I fund research that's not profitable?
Right. Well, okay. First of all, you probably wouldn't fund a lot of research that's not profitable, right? But for example, if we look at cancer research, right? A majority of cancer research in America, the funding comes from charitable donations. So, right, because people really care about cancer. Now, in terms of other things, yeah, like certain things probably won't get funding. But when you say the government creates a job, what you're really saying, right, is that somewhere between 40 to 52%, it kind of depends on how you look at the numbers, right? Whether or not you count inflation, property, like what property values go up. So like that changes property taxes more than the actual like percentile of property taxes, et cetera. Right. But what you're really saying is 40 to 52% of all of the wealth that was created in this country was taken, right? And then after we took possibly a very large minority or possibly a majority, right, of all of the funds out of the economy, we then created jobs with that money. But see, they didn't create that money, right? Like the only money that's created by the government, assuming we're not talking about like the Federal Reserve printing money for them, right, which causes inflation, obviously. But the only wealth created by the government is like the U.S. Postal Service, which has been bankrupt a ton of times, right? Like they're not actually a business. So they're not actually creating jobs. What they're doing is they're taking money from you and then creating a program and then saying, look at the jobs we created. You see what I'm saying? So they're not really creating jobs the way that a business is creating jobs. So I'm saying they're taking money from elsewhere out of the economy to then do something. So when you're like, oh, look how they created a job, it's like, yeah, with stolen money, like, you know what I mean? Like that would have gone elsewhere.
But there's money that goes to science that wouldn't have been going to science if it weren't for the government entity, because there just isn't, the bedrock of science innovation and research and hypothesis driven research is basically asking questions that, and seeing what's behind that curtain and just keep going, like there, how, like a good question is like, how does bacteria defend itself? That's not a question that could be, profited from, the research that ties to that. That's not
true.
Of course it can.
It's not true.
How would you like the molecular mechanisms of figuring out how like a bacteria defends itself isn't inherently profitable?
Okay, so a company does research. They do research all the time.
No.
Yeah, companies do this all the time.
No. You're misunderstanding.
You could look from.
No, so
companies.
Trust me. I'll get to what you're talking about. The research, the scientific bedrock questions aren't profitable. And these, like, for example, to bring into the bacterial defense question, Jennifer Doudna is, for 20 years did research on how do bacteria defend itself. That wasn't a profitable research question until she discovered they defended themselves by a thing called CRISPR, and then CRISPR was then allowed to be used at in biotechnology companies, and the biotechnology companies used that CRISPR, but they didn't actually research CRISPR to discover it. They used the foundational research question, the original one, and then copied it. I mean, I worked at a biotechnology company. This is exactly what we did.
It doesn't matter whether or not it's profitable. The polio vaccine, right? Or not polio vaccine, sorry. Fuck, now I can't think. Penicillin, right? Penicillin was not only done purely for scientific pursuits, but it was also tested on himself, right? and did that illegally against the government's wishes. And at the same time that other scientists were trying to attack him was the same time that he was getting nominated for a Nobel Prize. And then he gave it out for free without like maintaining intellectual property rights. Right. So this is a perfect example of a time where it's not profitable in any way, shape, or form. And someone still did that because that was what they valued. What I'm saying is that if you stopped stealing 40 to 52% of all of the wealth from the country, you'd see a lot more of that, especially once you curtailed all the government regulations that make it expensive or difficult to do these forms of research without the behest and approval of the state. Now, would it go down from a consequentialist analysis? Maybe. I don't know, but technology would also innovate in other places. And it's not this idea that like science and research is so isolated that we don't learn things from other disciplines, right, is kind of an old world view of science that like we started attacking in the 90s, right, is that we do need to be interdisciplinary. And I think, you can look at if that money wasn't taken, even if it wasn't a specific thing that wasn't profitable, there will be breakthroughs in things that are profitable that gain knowledge towards those things that make those things cheaper and easier to do. Like knowledge can be gained from domains that are profitable and then given either freely or sold or whatever, right? Towards things that are good for us. This idea that it can only be done by the government because the profit incentive isn't there is a view of capitalism that profit incentive is the only means by which businesses operate, or that by which individuals operate within a capitalist system. And that's just not true. Like charity exists. There's plenty of reasons that people invest in things that they wish to see, right? Like, so for example, the CEO of Merkel, right? Or the former CEO and CFO of Merkel, which is a giant insurance industry, multi-millionaire. I think he's like real close, but not quite there to being a billionaire, right? Well, his granddaughter had autism. And so because his granddaughter had autism, he set up the Faison Center, which is now the leading piece of autism research and early interventions in childhood development in the entirety of the United States of America, because this one rich guy had a granddaughter with autism and was like, yeah, I'm going to set up this center and we're going to do a ton of research there and we're going to help kids with autism. And so that's an example of how one person who has wealth values something and did something better than the government and Johns Hopkins University, at least in this very niche field, towards that research, simply because that was a passion project. If that guy, instead of having $800 million, didn't have all of his money stolen, we know that profit is exponential. So at the very minimum, it'd be a 1.6 billion, right? Or like 2 billion or 3 billion. If that guy had triple the fucking funds to invest in his pet project, we'd be in a much better world with better research on autism interventions for children. But unfortunately, we have a government that steals money and creates jobs.
I mean, it's just sad to think that we would have to sit there and wait for the angel investor in order to feel like that bacteria's immune system's worth investing into in order to research it, and probably would have never had.
I'd say the exact opposite. Yeah. I would say that it's sad that you think that people don't have the capacity to invest in those things, and you think that their money needs to be stolen so that the government can do these things because no individual would invest in that. And I think that that's just not true. I would say that you have a more pessimistic view of humans because you think they need to be stolen from in order for these things to be researched.
No, I mean, I'm definitely an optimist. I do think that there is a good nature in humans, and I agree with that. And like that's something that I actually really empathize with in the anarchist viewpoint of the world. Mm-hmm. It's just that there are lots of things that need to be researched that cost billions and billions of dollars. CERN, for example, is something that's like multi-nations. I mean, there's some things that can only be invested in at the national level or international level. And it just doesn't, we're talking about, like, for example, right now, like in the United States, we're actually spending for the first time ever more money in science and engineering than we are in the defense budget. So, I'm really happy about that. I'm really like that. That's a huge thing.
sure that's good. I mean, I think they're spending too much money in general, but which would be $1. But yeah, I don't. So the CERN thing is interesting, right? Because what we're comparing is kind of an imagined scenario versus the one we're in, right? Okay. Which is, what does a world look like where half of all the wealth isn't stolen from us versus one where half of all the wealth is stolen from us, but then those things are going towards projects that you kind of waste a lot of money on in the name of like the development of something like finding the fucking God particle, right? You know what I mean? Like finding Higgs boson is like crazy. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's insane. Like we haven't done much with it yet, but I'm sure insane things will come from that research at CERN. And like, would this world have created that? I think probably. Would it have done it slower? Would it have waited until the technology was in a better place? Maybe. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to compare the two. But like we do have other examples where people are like, oh, well, look at NASA, right? But there's a lot of mythology told about that, I think, too. You know what I mean? Like IBM created an entirely new computer system for NASA, but that was the impetus of government funding. So it's like this weird corporate public partnership, also known as fascism sometimes, but but we won't go there, right? You know what I mean? So it's like, is it really a fully public thing? But also, if the public thing was there, would IBM have done that in the first place? And the answer is maybe not as quickly. Mm-hmm. So it's really difficult to say. Like, what I would say is that I have faith in humanity, that if our potential and freedom was unleashed and we weren't crippled under so much oppressive taxation, that we would see innovations the likes of which like we can't even imagine. And I think if we had been living in a free society, it's not even impossible for me to imagine that we'd be living in a post-scarcity world at this point. Like, honestly, like at least in terms of like material resources, obviously brain power and your body is a scarce resource, et cetera. But yeah, I don't know that the argument is, well, look at these big things that money has been spent on, right? Obviously it works. It's like, well, obviously it was successful at creating CERN, but I don't know that that's a good counter argument that the free market wouldn't have done that because of the idea of profitability. I think what you're doing is you're overlaying assumptions about capitalism as a system, as opposed to what a world looks like where half of our resources aren't taken by the government. Okay,
well, I'm going to give you an example of something that I think is
go ahead.
One of the biggest things that I think that we are missing, and because there's a big gap, I think, between the research scale, and like the pilot scale, and then the national scale, right? And that needs a ton of money. And this, the Inflation Reduction Act does put a lot of money towards things like algae biofuels, like for the first time that we can maybe go from the scale up stage. And that's the biggest problem really, is because it works at the pilot stage. We know it works, but then we just don't have the money to go to that national stage. And, I think like algae biofuels, basically, like the fuel that is in our car right now is basically, hundreds of millions year old plants, and all the weight of the earth basically puts it into like kind of a slurry, which is like the crude oil that they extract from the ground, and then they purify out basically the fats or the lipids of the plant matter, and then that's what is our gas. The number and the octane actually refers to how many carbon chains there are in that lipid molecule. So algae
after learning about Teflon, that scares the shit out of me. You know what I mean? Like after I learned about Teflon poisoning, I was like, oh shit, man, that sucks.
That's pretty gnarly. But I mean, the thing is algae has the ability to actually create all of the gas and all those lipids that are needed in order for us to be 100% renewable, 100% self-sufficient, so we aren't reliant on foreign oil and imports and stuff like that. And that's actually why the Department of Defense, who says the number one threat right now is climate change, they're putting so much money into algae biofuels, specifically because, for example, the Air Force and the Navy need complex aromatic rings in order to create jet fuel, and algae can actually do that. So and algae, this is such an insane point that nobody makes it. And this is your thing's nuclear. This is my thing is like algae. If you're not, I don't understand why people don't talk about this, but it's like, I can.
No, that's good. I'm glad.
I can make my 92 Ford Ranger a completely renewable car without having to go and make new batteries like, a Tesla or an electronic vehicle does. I can make that 1992 truck completely renewable by algae biofuels. And we can use all the existing infrastructure. We're talking about trillions of dollars of pipelines, of tanks, of gas stations. Nothing would change. Nothing would change about your life that if you have a combustion engine, you just go to the gas station and out comes algae biofuels as opposed to, the carbon from the ground. And that's the big problem with emissions, by the way, is that we're basically taking carbon that's supposed to be in the ground and we're putting it into the air. Algae takes carbon from the air and puts it back into the air. So you do have emissions. You have a combustion engine and you have emissions, but the only cost of algae biofuels, the carbon footprint, if you will, is the cost of changing it from algae to that lipid, and that's actually, we're like researching it right now. We're trying to make it better, but that is the biggest problem, and it's actually removing the water from the slurry because obviously water and oil don't work well together. So people are trying to get the water out of that. So the problem is I don't get why the market is there. Exxon is actually investing hundreds of millions of dollars into this, and the J. Craig Venner companies like Synthetic Genomics in San Diego, they see it. The gas companies see it, but instead of having to buy an all new car and establish an all new infrastructure for electric vehicles, contributing to the problem that you were talking about before with the vehicles, the rare earth minerals, the labor that's involved. We can take our existing infrastructure and just use a renewable source for it. And by the way, we could do it. We could.
Right. So I actually love that you brought up algae biofuels, right? Specifically, because I agree with you. I think that is something that definitely needs research and development, and like it would solve a lot of fucking problems, especially just in cars. One of the biggest proponents of algae biofuel that put tens of millions of dollars in research into it was actually UPS, right? UPS was specifically, their former CEO was a big environmentalist and thought that he could actually, for profit, have a better, but was also valued that technology growth. And so he put tons and tons of money into research into algae biofuels, but eventually they had to scrap it because it was just too expensive for them to continue because they didn't have like the ability to kind of like pull funds from elsewhere. And so, I would say that again, if the government hadn't stolen 40 to 52% of our wealth, right, we might already be in a world where algae biofuels are a normal thing because the government stopped stealing from us. And UPS would have had so much more funding to actually be able to continue their research in terms of at least jet fuel, so that planes could run on algae biofuel sustainably without some of the issues that they were coming with, because they really wanted to be the company that could more cheaply and effectively do next day air and like air flights of packages very quickly. And they thought that the key to doing that was algae biofuel, but they just didn't have the money to do it. And so, if the government got the fuck out of it and stopped spending their wasted money on their selectively edited programs and just let the market handle things, we would have algae biofuels, and we would have to thank the for-profit corporation UPS for that.
I mean, it's interesting that the government subsidies of the oil companies make algae biofuels artificially more expensive.
True.
And that's one of the big problems is that oil companies don't create a product. They don't. They have a product that's already in the ground, and they refine their product and then they sell it to us. Like, for example, for me, I work in algae biofuels. I'm biased, by the way, but I mean, I work on like the genetically modifying algae in order to make them better, not like in the engineering part. So I've been working in algae.
Yeah, no, that's super fucking dope, though.
So but the point is that like that these oil companies are refining their product. They're not creating those carbon chains. Like, but for us in the algae biofuels space, we have to engineer algae that make those carbon rings and then figure out how to refine it. They're already, at the finished stage. I mean, like imagine Apple like having to just mine out the MacBook 15 or whatever. You know what I mean? Oh, we found a new MacBook, guys. It's like it doesn't exist, man. Like it's just so unfair. And then on top of that, giving tens of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the most profitable venture that's ever existed in the world. It's just so frustrating to me.
Finally, we have a massive place of agreement. I completely agree. The idea that the idea that like we recognize that humans are doing some form of damage. Now, I also think that we should get out of their way in terms of like some of the some of the things like like for example in Biden in the excessive taxation of new oh my god, what is it, new not refineries,
gas cars,
the drilling things.
Oh
no, the where you drill oil. I can't think of the name of it. It doesn't matter. The leases, right? Like the Louisiana Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, basically ruled that the new environmental taxes were so high that it literally priced them out of being able to even do so, and that they were like so cost prohibitive that they were like that it was illegal, and so he just suspended them in general, right? Like I think environmental activists and things like that getting in the way of fracking, getting in the way of the oil companies and things like that is a problem. But I also think that those subsidies are rights violations as well. And I think we could easily balance these two things out, right? Like, what I mean? The net, if we got rid of all of these subsidies and also got rid of those massive taxations from like leases and things like that, I think you would probably see like a balancing effect to some degree. But I still think that the subsidies far outweigh the moratoriums on new leases and things like that. But ultimately, as a libertarian, I'm more concerned with the state interfering in the market based off of what it thinks is best, instead of letting people's values and the market and the natural supply and demand equation of the market and what people value being there. And I think the more effective and the more moral system, right, is to allow that to occur, but then to fight for people to value things that are better. Right. To fight for things like more research in algae biofuels, or, more research and development in thorium reactors, things that are more sustainable and better for the environment, and will eventually have better outcomes for everyone, both in terms of profit and sustainability and everything. Like we also need more geothermal, right? Like in places that can do it, like the cost is prohibitive for the production, right, of a site, right? But over time it saves money. It's like a lot of money, especially if we were actually to deregulate the oil and gas company to the point where they could get sued for the pollution that they do, right? Because that's another big thing, is that they do pollution and then they're immune from lawsuits in most cases from the direct pollution that they do to people. And it's like, well, yeah, the reason it's cost prohibitive is that they're allowed to aggress upon other people's clean air and allowed to poison their water. And then like, so long as it's within EPA standards, like this isn't a problem. Right. I think once the market is opened up to that, like most of these companies will be like, fuck, dude, like this, we really have to clean up our factory or our insurance is going to go through the roof and we're going to get sued all the time.
I mean, so if we agree that humans are causing a negative impact to the environment, and we did before, what if we valued that? And what do you think about like a cap and trade system in order to try to see it, like things like, for example, like coal has been by market forces just kind of like pushed out by fracking, and it's actually a huge win for, emissions, and emissions are going down because of it. What do you think about just like a cap and trade system in general?
Yeah, I think cap and trade is again, it's an immoral system and it's ineffective, right? Like we saw, the early introduction of like cap and trade and the demand for, lower carbon emissions in the UK, right? In the beginning in the mid 90s, right? And what were the effects of those policies? The effect of those policies was increased carbon emissions. They just claim they had less carbon emissions because they offshored their manufacturing to places like India and China that had horrible factories, right? That had no regulations and nobody gave a fuck, where the air is not breathable, and then using more gas and fuel to ship those things from halfway around the fucking world, right? And so when you actually look at the carbon footprint of the products per capita, what you saw was an increase in carbon emissions because of things like cap and trade and stuff like that. Really, all that is a means of offsetting manufacturing to other places for wealthy businesses and pricing out small businesses out of the market, and an increase in carbon emissions. And this is what happens when the government gets involved in these things. Is they don't actually fix the fucking problems. They just sweep them under the rug and then claim victory. So like, yeah, I don't think cap and trade is good. One, because it's an immoral system, right? That is not done in terms of natural law and people's individual liberty and businesses' ability to achieve. But also, I just don't think it's efficacious.
Do you think that like natural law pertains to people in the future?
I think natural law pertains to all people that are persons capable of inductive and deductive reasoning, which would include like artificial general intelligence. Well, I think it's based philosophically upon axioms, right? And so while it doesn't currently apply to people that don't exist yet, right? Okay. Because they don't exist, right? Those principles hold true forever. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess like I don't.
I hear the kiddos in the background.
Yeah. Mom's doing an awesome job. I don't agree with like a lot of the like alarmist like things where it's like we have to completely change society, because I think that's just like that's a non-starter for a lot of people. You know, I think that kind of just that kind of rhetoric is damaging, because
well, it's also not scientific, right? It's alarmism and
there's cause for it. You know, it's worse than you think it is. Let's be honest. Like, you know, a lot of the people in the renewable energy like and space and stuff, you know, it's like we're optimistic, like we are, you know, like you were saying, like there are people out there that do work that aren't for profits specifically, and I would argue scientists do that, since we all talk about how we could be making way more money, you know, doing going into finance or whatever like that, or working for one of the big, you know, tech companies or something like that. But we're purposely choosing to contribute solutions to problems that we see in the world, and I just think that like,
well, I would say that that's a value, right? I think the idea of profit isolated is really a bad way of looking at things, because like people will talk about like, look at how underpaid teachers are and look at how much money like coders make. This isn't fair. Yeah. And it's like, well, people don't go into coding because like, I mean, some people do, they're called autists, you know, but like for the most part, people don't go into coding because they're just like massively like, you know, passionate about the code, right? Most people aren't like looking at the matrix, like, oh, the numbers are beautiful, right? They go into it because they can make fucking money, right? People go into teaching because they want to be a part of shaping a new generation, because they want to feel fulfilled. They want to feel like they're a part of something good. And I think that that's probably true of a lot of scientists like yourself, right? Part of the pay is that you're working on something that is a part of the future, right? You're working on something that leads to a better world for your children. And you get to come home and you get to look at those babies in the eyes and know that like what you did today was designed to make a better world for them. And that's a hard thing to put a price tag on, right? And so I think this idea of like focusing on for profit and things like that, I think really comes from a mindset of like looking at the system of capitalism as like an economic model and like trying to isolate it from the humans that live in it, and then like an unfairly malign the things that you don't like about that system, and then otherize things that are a part of those things.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that one of the problems with focusing specifically on emissions is that it's kind of like one of those things where we're sounding the alarm, but people can't do anything about it individually, right?
Today.
Where it's like you could buy a Tesla, but then you live in Missouri and they're chugging coal.
It's like 80% coal.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like
Did you see that video? There's like a video going around where like they were showing like some small towns like first like Tesla plug-in, and like the mayor was there and everything, and then like a journalist was like, how much of your energy is coal? And like the first lady was like, oh, I don't know. Like the mayor or like the person that was in charge of it was like, oh, I don't know. And then they talked to a different government official that actually like does this, and then he's like about 80 to 90% coal, and it was just like, yeah,
that's gross.
Oh fuck,
That's
you're not doing
gross.
anything.
Yeah, I mean, imagine that person thinking that they're doing a good thing, and then they're watching the CO2 ppms, and it just keeps going up, and you're like, what's going on? And you're like, well, by the way, I tried.
Or like in California, they're facing brownouts and blackouts potentially, and then they're like also mandating that everyone has an electric car by 2030.
Yeah, I think that is a problem.
Dog, like your energy grid is weak. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like,
yeah, I agree with you. But I think like the discussion should be about like the discussion on how we should, if humans are negatively impacting the environment, which I agree, and that's kind of like how I would talk to people kind of like as a scientist about this. And I wish that this discussion was at this level about how we can actually individually impact it. And it's more of like, the individual's power is more on the line of like zoning, for example, like for, zoning meetings and commissions and boards at your city hall, like have a big impact on like natural places not being segmented, because there's the biggest problem that we're having right now, like in the environment, is that stuff is dying. Stuff is dying.
I disagree. I think the biggest impact that you can do is that you can take the time to research the companies and the products that you buy, right? And if you're buying products from Nestle, you're fucking up, right? Like you know what I'm saying? Like if you're buying products from companies that are a part of the problem in that regard, then you're choosing to. So for example, there was a wonderful company, they got bought out by Lay's, so I no longer support them. But when they weren't, and many of you may know this company and may not know that they were bought out by Lay's. But this company was, they made potato chips. What is the Kettle? Was it Kettle brand? Yeah, Kettle chips. So before they were bought out by Lay's, what they did is they used all of the potato skins and they turned their potato skins into like alcohol-based fuel that they used in their own factory. They gave to local charities. They gave like a percentage of all of their profits to reforestation and nature conservation in their local community at their factories. They were incredible. Like their bags had like these like weird, like kind of like sun chips. They were these thick, like crinkly, loud bags. And it's because they were like done in a much more environmentally sustainable way with a lot of like plant material in them. They were a great company and their chips were delicious. And then Lay's bought them and then they stopped being a great company in that way. You know what I mean? But I mean, like, but if you knew that at the time, right, it would have been a great company to support and buy from. I think you have more. I think people have more purchasing power in terms of changing things than they realize.
I don't disagree with you on that. I think that, and especially for, but again, this is like more of an emissions look on things, on how they're looking at it, and that's the problem that I think that we're in, and that's why this problem seems so insurmountable. Is that because we've created this behemoth that we can't just solve? Like like for example, like 70% of animal populations, just the numbers of animals that are out there, are down by 70% in the last 50 years. It's like 90% of wetlands that have gone extinct within the last 50 years. And that doesn't have to deal the vast majority of that does not have to deal with CO2 ppms. This has to do with like human activity, right? This is people wanting to live at the coast, wanting to live near rivers. These are, wetland ecosystems that are going
well,
extinct.
it's a importation of invasive plant species is another big part of that, right? Like there's the interconnectivity of humans and bringing in like Japanese Cuzco to like America, and now like Japanese Cuzco is fucking everywhere, and it like ruins certain trees. Right. It just fucks up a whole forest.
Exactly. Yeah, invasive species are a huge problem.
Oh, Cudzco, not
Even
kudzu. Sorry.
Even the California mustard, which is, I live in California. You can see these, 4-foot tall.
Of course, you
mustard.
fucking live in California. You lefty fucking scientist, fucking weirdo. Of course, you live in Cali.
University of California, man. We're just slaying it. It's an invasive
Liberty
species.
for my grad school. I went to a Christian university as an atheist. It was fun.
My point is that, like, even the California mustard, the one that's named after California, is an invasive species. It's pretty nuts. But I guess like the bigger problem is that we are impacting the environment negatively in so many different ways that, emissions and CO2 ppm is kind of like a large problem that could only be really solved at the national and international level, in my opinion, where it's kind of like you can have like a national government that would be regulating and incentivizing renewable fuels, that kind of like energy production, as opposed to at the local level where you can make a big impact at zoning commissions, creating connected nature, and that would cleaning up your local parks, that kind of stuff. I mean, you do have like a huge impact on that, and if people everywhere kind of like got more connected with nature, then people would care more about these places, and the animal populations would come back. And because we know, environmental health is going down basically, and that's not good. But we know in ecology, two things that make a really healthy environment. One, it's lots of animals that live there, and then two, lots of species, a lot of different species.
Yeah, biodiversity.
Exactly, biodiversity in numbers.
Yeah. Which is a big problem, right? So I will say two things. Number one, we're comparing it to an imaginary system, right? Which is, what would we have if we didn't have half of our wealth taken, right? So again, the idea, the impetus is we have a problem, therefore we need to steal from people to fund the solution to this problem. Involves a morally unjustifiable thing, which is the theft from people. So I'll never support that, right? The second is one needs perfect knowledge in order to gauge consequentialism from a normative ethical framework, right?
Okay.
Because you need to know the future impact of all of the decisions that you make, as well as, the current impact, and you need to know all of them. And even then you're still going to have a subjective bias in terms of what you value, right? In terms of like, if your value is, let's say, human flourishment, right? Like, these are things that are they're difficult, nigh impossible to measure. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'll never support those things just because they involve immoral, unjustifiable things. I have no problem with supporting voluntary means of doing and solving these problems. And I think you can see from our conversation that I do view that. The other thing I need to say is that one of the cool things about having an active chat is when you say something wrong, they immediately shit on you for it. Okay. So it was not bought by Lay's. It was bought by Snyder's. Okay. Snyder's Lance, which makes Campbell's soup. Okay. Different company. Still, if you check their website, all the fucking cool shit that they used to do, they no longer brag about because they're not doing that shit anymore. But I said the wrong company. All right. I'll take that fucking L. If that's the worst thing I've said tonight, I guess I'm okay with it.
I guess my biggest fear is that we are in a tragedy of the commons scenario where we don't see the importance of the, environmental health being so important to human health in the future. We see our humans in the environment being completely abstracted from one another, and then them just dying off where we can't recover it. And there are technological solutions that are out there for maybe seeding the oceans with iron, for example. So then you could actually bring down more CO2 and then maybe burying that, algae bloom or something like that, and burying some of that CO2. But, if an entire ecosystem goes extinct, we have no idea how to bring that back. We haven't done the sequencing to know the diversity that's out there. There's millions of species out there that we don't even know about. 99.9% of microbes that that are out there have never been used in the lab, cultured in the lab or sequenced. So, and if we lose the microbes in the ocean, for example, like that's where 60 to 70% of our oxygen comes from. I mean, they're called ecosystem services, where they have complete, it's basically everything that you can see, that you can touch right now, or if you look around you, is somehow tied to the ecosystem and the environment in some way.
Oh no, I agree. But I think the biggest problem and the biggest reason we have this tragedy of the commons is high time preference, right? I think that what the state has done by creating social welfare systems for people and stealing so many of their resources is that we have a very large percentage of the poor and lower middle class in our countries that have an incredibly high marginal propensity to consume, right? Okay. Values of 1 and over 1. And so what has occurred is a psychological kind of religious statism that the government will fix these problems, take more of my money. And so what ends up happening is we trust a corrupt institution run by people that are bought off by corporations, instead of having a society of people that have a low time preference, that think more about the future, think about investment, think about like, what am I going to do with grandma in 10 years, right? All of these things that we give the government to do. And I think it has created an infantile, sheepish society of people that give it over to an organization that is ill-equipped to be able to do this at all. And so, like, believe it or not, many people see a libertarian or a conservative economically and they go, oh, this guy, he's clearly like not going to be about this environmentalism shit. I actually am really passionate about environmentalism. I just think that the proposed solutions are those that benefit large corporations and Malthusian communists that want large state power to violate our rights instead of actually solving these fucking problems. And I don't agree that stealing tons of resources for government funding of programs to presumably fix these problems is the way to go about it. I think we need to free up these resources, and we need to have conversations like this where, you argue for algae biofuels, I argue for nuclear, right? We inform people about some of the issues with the oil industry and some of the solar and wind issues, and we like kind of figure out what these solutions are, and we free up the economy for innovation. And you know what I mean? Like, imagine a world where so much of this money wasn't taken. Like, what individuals could have possibly achieved, right? Like, for example, one of the things that we know isn't effective currently because of our technology are those machines that, carbon capture from the atmosphere. But like, that might have been that's something that can turn a profit, right? Because you can turn carbon capture into fertilizer. And so if we didn't have such massive regulation and taxation, and we had the ability to innovate in certain ways, we might be able to create, we might be in a world, like, it's fiction, who fucking knows, right? But we might already be in a world where carbon capture machines are highly profitable, and we don't have to fucking worry about emissions because we have fucking giant, really effective machines that pull out massive carbon out of the atmosphere, turn it into fertilizer, which would also solve some of our nitrogen, our newer nitrogen fertilizer issues in, let's say, the Netherlands and Canada, and we wouldn't have the EU cracking down on them, which is going to starve hundreds of millions of people.
I don't know about
in the name of environmentalism.
Interesting. I haven't heard about that. I mean, I know that there's a huge runoff problem with nitrogen that happens. Yeah,
they're demanding that places cut their nitrogen emissions by 40 to 90%, depending on where they are. Yeah, and it's basically going to destroy what is the second largest producer of farming. The amount of agriculture that gets produced, if it goes through in the name of environmentalism, it's going to massively reduce the amount of vegetables and bread that is and wheat that is in the world.
That's crazy.
You combine that with like what's going on in the Ukraine, which is another breadbasket, and you're looking at mass starvation in a year or two if all those policies go through.
Interesting. I hadn't heard about this. This is interesting. We actually
look up the Dutch farmers' protests.
We're actually working on this exact thing. I actually wrote one of my reviews I wrote for Nature Nanotechnology had to deal with delivering micronutrients to plants in order to stop this from kind of happening. Basically, the runoff the larger ecological problem here is that
so hold on. You're saying if you can increase the delivery rate, more is absorbed and you have less runoff?
Yeah, basically microdosing them as they need it. So like, and also delivering through nanotechnology the nitrogen and the micronutrients exactly where they need it in the plant, so that you don't have like all this nitrogen going into the soil, going into the water, which leads to oxygen minimal zones in the oceans that kill off fish pools. That's like when you see like 3,000 fish died on a beach and you're like, why would it kill that many fish? It's like, well, it's a school of fish that just, they ran out of oxygen and they all died. It had to do with nitrogen runoff. So
that's awesome. That's cool. I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not a big science person, but then you know what I mean? So like, I think people like you often get desensitized at just how cool some shit is. You know what I mean? Like, and then you hear it like, and you're not like in that field and you're like, that's fucking awesome, man. Like, I wish you success in that, even if you're doing it with stolen government money.
Yeah, dude. So
even more so do I wish success, you know? I just,
I mean, it's like with the little, it's actually really cool. There's like a quantum dot or a carbon dot. It's literally just like a dot of carbon and stuff, like a ball. And we're talking about like 1 to 3 nanometers here. They're super, super small. And then we connect it to like a little basket. And then in that basket, we can put in whatever we want. So we could put in like the micronutrient or something, and then target that little nanoparticle with the basket to wherever we want in the cell. So that's kind of like what my lab is. Well, the lab that I'm in is working on. I'm not the PI, but
that's pretty cool. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know.
Cool.
I don't know how that'll work, but like, hopefully it works.